Hey, this is the Haftarah Shimini, and we're in 2 Samuel chapter 6, starting verse 1, all the way to chapter 7, verse 17. Now, this is the Haftarah that talks about how David got the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem after its sort of long and sordid history after being captured by the Philistines. Now, I have to tell you that this Haftarah really blew me away. It was all the history that was surrounding the story of how the ark was captured and all those extra details of the journey to Jerusalem that are found throughout the Tanakh, and how the ark ended up getting away from the Israelites in the first place. Now, I have been, um, and, and this isn't a bad thing, but I've been so focused on the Torah for so many years that it's actually been a while since I've spent um, a lot of time in the sort of history parts of the Tanakh, the Old Testament. And so I was really challenged this week to play catch up in a sense and relook at the background surrounding this particular Haftarah with the Ark. Now, I'm not giving myself a guilt trip for not, you know, reading all throughout the Bible every day. And I'm not laying one on you either, if you're like me and maybe you've kind of forgotten some of these history points. I guess what I'm saying is that I really enjoyed the history part of the story this week. I mean, we're going to get into the spiritual lessons, of course, but this week I got a healthy dose of, I don't know, reality that God's word is so vast and it's filled with all of this wonderful history, all of this material. And again, I was struck with the idea that you and we get to learn all of this. We're never going to run out of material when it comes to God's Word that we can learn about and we can learn from, and material that we engage with God with. So it was overwhelming to me, but in a good way. So what I want to do is I want to look at the history and the story before this Haftarah. Okay. You've read the Haftarah this week already, right? If you have not, then right now would be a really good time for you to pause. Go ahead and read that 2 Samuel 6 and 7, and then come back for the lesson. Okay, you're ready to get some background? Now, I want you to have this background because there's a lesson that we can learn from that unfortunate incident in the Haftarah where Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady the ark when the ark is on its way to Jerusalem. And we're going to get to that in a little bit. And also this incident with Uzzah, that's the tie-in with the Torah portion this week, because where we're reading in Leviticus this week, we read about Nadab and Abihu kindling that unauthorized fire in the tabernacle when it was being consecrated. Okay, so many years, I think it was about 70 years before the events that were recorded in our Haftarah took place, the ark containing the tablets of the covenant, that was captured by the Philistines. And they displayed it as a trophy, kind of like one of the spoils of war. But they understood the significance of it, having captured the ark. They understood that in a way that maybe is a little lost on us in modern times. So I want to fill in some of those blanks. Okay. First, let me just give kind of a brief mention of who the Philistines were. Okay. So for sure, they were God's enemies, and they were hell bent on overpowering the Israelites and erasing them as like a whole people group. I didn't grow up in the church, but I do remember hearing the term Philistines, that they were uncouth, that they were barbaric people. And it was funny, but their name was associated with those things. And so if you wanted to insult somebody, you would say, oh, he's acting like a Philistine. He has no class or something like that. But actually, the Philistines were well organized and they were highly cultured. They were first class at raising crops. I think they excelled in raising grapes and olives. I read that somewhere. Um, they had a lot of trade. They with neighboring nations, and the nations appreciated their craftsmanship when it came to their pottery. So basically, the Philistines were a cultural force to be reckoned with. And that makes me remember that enemies of God can actually look like they're prospering. Their culture can have some elements of looking like they're doing okay for themselves. Now, there's a reason that I'm focusing on the Philistines here, so bear with me just a little bit while I get us to that point, okay? So the Philistines, they served a god called Dagon. Now, Dagon was primarily associated with fertility, which would include those abundant crop harvests, but also dealt with anointing kings and leaders. And there are some ancient texts, apparently, that connect Dagon as the father of Baal, which I thought was interesting. And of course, we've talked about Baal in our earlier Haftarahs. Well, it turns out that this Dagon was one of the gods that the nation of Israel had occasionally begun to serve. Now, we're going to skip to Judges for just a second. In Judges chapter 10, verse 6, and this was before King David, right? So this is before the time of our Haftarah, but it says this. It says, then the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashereths, the gods of Syria, Sidon, Moab, the people of Ammon, and the gods of the Philistines. And they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. So that was Dagon. Now, the Philistines had several temples dedicated to Dagon, and these were stationed in different cities throughout their region. So, in the battle that took place where the Philistines took the ark, captured the ark, they put the ark in one of their temples in the city state called Ashdod. And they put the ark at the feet of a big statue of Dagon. And they did this as a symbol of their victory. Now, make no mistake about this, it was a symbol of their victory over the Israelite nation, but mainly it was a symbol of the defeat, so called defeat, of Dagon over the God of Israel. So here's a lesson. When we see things with our human eyesight, we don't always see the reality when it comes to God's way of seeing things. So, from a merely human standpoint, at this point, it looks like God is, in a sense, being held hostage by the Philistines. Now, I say that, and I want you to keep in mind the way that idols worked in the ancient Near East. The idol and the God are treated as synonymous. So, when the ark was positioned beside Dagon, remember that the stone idol itself of Dagon, that was the object of Philistine worship. So to pray to Dagon meant to pray to the stone. Now, God has told us over and over again specifically, do not worship him the way the pagans worship their gods. So no one was ever instructed to worship the Ark of the Covenant as if it were God. It was a symbol of God's presence among the people. But you can bet that there was always going to be confusion on the part of the Israelites, and certainly confusion on the part of the Philistines about the nature of the ark. So it might have, in some sense, represented God a little bit more than how God wanted himself to be represented. Okay, so we're actually camping out a little bit right now in 1 Samuel chapter 5, and that's a whole one chapter before we get to our Haftarah. So, and we're going to camp out there for a little bit longer before we jump to our Haftarah. So I wouldn't blame you a bit if you wanted to pause this video right now and then go read 1 Samuel 5 about Dagon and the ark. That story is really, really inspiring. Okay, so Israel's God is not an idol, and he does not need for men to carry him around like Dagon needed. Now, I want you to let that, I mean, yes, that's obvious, but I want you to let that soak in for what we're going to talk about later, okay? It is God who is the one who carries Israel. Now, I want to read you, we're in Isaiah. I'm going to jump to Isaiah, and I'm going to read you Isaiah chapter 40, verses 18 through 26. This idea that is God who carries Israel. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare with him? As for the idol, a craftsman casts it, a goldsmith plates it with gold, and a silversmith fashions chains of silver. He who is too impoverished for such an offering selects a tree that does not rot. He seeks out for himself a skilled craftsman to prepare an idol that will not totter. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the vault of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. He it is who reduces rulers to nothing, who makes judges of the earth meaningless. Scarcely have they been planted, scarcely have they been sown, scarcely has their stock taken root in the earth, but he merely blows on them and they wither, and the storm carries them away like stubble. To whom then will you liken me, that I should be his equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes on high and see who has created the stars, the one who leads forth their host by number. He calls them by name. Because of the greatness of his might and the strength of his power, not one of them is missing. So picture this. The Philistines have been overjoyed at the defeat, so-called defeat of the Israelites, and capturing the ark, so as to defeat the God of Israel. Now, I wonder what the Israelites have been thinking this whole time. Because the ark, though it wasn't an idol, it did convey the divine presence of God, which meant that the servants of Dagon had defeated God on the battlefield, in a sense, showing possibly which of these two gods reigned supreme. That's certainly what the Philistines were thinking. So the ark of God goes into the house of Dagon, and it's placed in a symbolically subordinate position at the feet. Well, the Philistines are actually in for a very, very rude awakening. Because the next morning, when the priests of Dagon go in to minister in the temple, their idol of Dagon lies prostrate in the dirt before the ark of God. And it's funny, I can imagine that morning the flurry of activity between or among the priests, getting the idol to stand up again and then kind of securing it down so that it wouldn't accidentally fall over again. Next morning, same thing. The idol has fallen again, but this time Dagon's hands and his head have been removed and they're placed in the doorway of the temple. So from that point on, the priests of Dagon don't want to go anywhere near the idol. They're terrified. And then the people of Ashdod start getting tumors and they start dying. And this plague, whatever this is, starts to spread to the nearby villages. So the Philistines are now in a panic and they're like, could it be this ark? So they send the ark to the city of Gath, more death. Then they send the ark to the city of Ekron, and more death. And then there's more to that story. But the question is, what is God up to? Was the capture of the ark not a defeat after all? Was it a strategic plan all along to show who really has the power? Because only God could do something like that. And he could do it without anyone's help. Now, if only all the people, the Israelites, the Philistines, would know that, if only they would know that there's nowhere that the ark could have been taken, that God didn't want it to go. Now, the ones who had fashioned and created this idol of Dagon, they made the statue, but they didn't create those raw materials, right? Only our God did. And Dagon fell face down in front of the ark, representing God's presence. Dagon bowed. So this tells us that even in a pagan temple, even there, God still has ownership. He still reigns supreme. He made it all, and he will hold on to it even in the midst of supposed rivals, and even when it looks to human eyes to be very, very bleak. Okay, now I'm going to jump right into our Haftarah. Okay. Um, the scene is now it's a fun story. It's an interesting story how the Philistines got the ark to the land of Israel. Unfortunately, time doesn't allow me to go into all of that. So jumping ahead, we're now at the point of the ark's journey to Jerusalem, and the ark slips on a cart, and it looks like it's about to fall. And Uzzah, who is one of Abinadab's sons, or maybe he was a grandson. I've heard it a couple of different ways, because Hebraically, when it talks about the sons of, that can mean just descendants. Okay, Abinadab was the one who, for about a number of years, was housing the ark, and his family was being blessed and prospering by God. So Uzzah, one of the two brothers, reaches out to grab the ark, right? Okay, so we're not really getting very far into our Haftarah story, and then I want to pause again because I want you to understand something that I hadn't considered before when I was thinking about this story, when I've read it before. I didn't think about this until it was actually pointed out to me in a commentary by First Fruits of Zion. And I don't think the text tells us how old Uzzah was, but the ark had been in the possession of his family for about 70 years since the Philistines returned the ark. So keep in mind that those two brothers, they would have been custodians of the ark, and they would have been blessed by the presence of the ark for as long as they could remember. And they're accompanying this ark as it leaves their care. Like they were solely tasked with caring for it. Okay. So at that point, I'm thinking, there's been some milestones in the life of my children as they've grown up. And maybe you can relate to this too, those of you who have children. Certain times where they're growing up and they're no longer in my care, right? I homeschooled all my children, but a really good example is the child who's public schooled or private schooled, kindergarten, their first day of school. They're leaving our care and they're being put into the care of someone that is not me, right? So I can certainly relate to the possible feelings of overprotection that these two who are traveling with the ark might have, right? So back to our back to our story. The oxen stumble and the cart kind of shifts a little bit. And that one custodian, Uzzah, in an effort to save the ark, he reaches out with his hand to steady it. And we know that that doesn't go well for him. Now, I know a lot of people read this account and they've got a really hard time accepting God's punishment or accepting the natural consequence that occurred. I don't I don't happen to believe that God punished Uzzah for some moral failing in this scene or for some harboring some secret sin that he had in his heart that nobody else knew about or anything like that. But I'm not really going to get into that aspect so much. But I think there's a lesson here for us. So I do agree that those who say, um, heroic act or not, Uzzah did end up profaning the sanctity of God's name when it came to this ark. So I think he profaned the sanctity of God's name. And the reason that I wanted to spend as much time as I did on that backstory with the Philistines and the ark is that I kind of want to set the stage for this moment with Uzzah. The ark was under God's care. And in while the ark was in the temple of Dagon, right? And God demonstrated that it was under his care the whole time. And he demonstrated in some unmistakable ways that he knew exactly what was going on. This is exactly in his plan. Now, this was about 70 years, with Dagon in the temple. That was about 70 years before the events of our Haftarah. So, one thing that it helps me to understand and remember is that we need to pay attention to the stories of old. We need to remember those stories of God's sovereignty and his ability to set things right according to his plan. So we need to hear about those stories even though we weren't in them personally. We need to hear about them and we need to remember them. And I know that's not easy to do. But the truth of the matter is that Uzzah should have known that God didn't need his assistance, especially when the assistance meant going against Torah. Because remember, the ark was only supposed to be carried on poles, not on a cart in the first place, right? So, how can this story, where I've taken all this time to set up the scene, how can this story help you in your day-to-day life? Well, what comes to mind for me um, are all the times that I think I need to support God's plans because I think that his plans have stumbled and slipped a little bit. Now, I'm not talking against the idea that you hear me repeat over and over and over again that we're partners with God, because we definitely are partners with God, and it's amazing that he wants to partner with us in his redemption story. But that's when he says that we're to partner. We can't just go barreling into a scene that he's in perfect control over. And I mean, is there ever a time when he's not perfectly in control? We can't just go in there and reach our hand out and steady a cart. Now, we're not going to suddenly die like Uzzah did. And how do I know this? Well, because I steady God's cart. I've done that many, many times and I'm still here. But each time that I do, I end up diminishing him in the world. I fail to sanctify his name. I fail to proclaim that I trust his plan completely because I think I need to steady the cart. And each time, I guess in a sense, I mean, I may die a little bit inside, whether I recognize it or not. It's what I'm thinking now after having read this Haftarah. I die to faith, and my self that grows, that idea that I know better than God. And all of that takes me a bit farther away from God. So I really do think that we need to learn these stories of God, and we need to teach them to our children, to our neighbors, to our friends, to those in our spheres. we need to be we need to be so sure that God carries the world and has no need for us to carry him. He doesn't need me interfering with his plans for my adult children. That always gets me. He doesn't need me interfering with his plans for my husband, and he doesn't need me interfering and steadying the cart of his plans for me. Now, I can ask him where he wants me included in any of those situations, but I can't be presumptuous and assume that it's okay for me to steady the cart. So, in a lot of ways, this Haftarah disturbed me. It disturbed me because I am Uzzah. There's a lot of places in my life where I steady the cart. And if I'm being honest, some of these are so closely tied to my identity that without God's help, I don't know if I want to remove my hand. And I wonder if maybe you can relate. And I think that's why I like that backstory of this Haftarah so much. Just the visual, on that pagan idol bowing down to God, as it were. And the idea that the Philistines thought that they had really gotten a good one over on God, but they actually played right into his hand. So all along, God was in control, and he was setting all of this up in order to provide a very important point that he is supreme over Dagon. It had to be done that way so that that point could be made. So after having spent some time in this Haftarah, I think the next time that I'm tempted to put up my hand to steady my God who needs no steadying from me, I think I'll at least think twice. And maybe, just maybe, now I will let him do his thing, and I'll ask him if there's any place in it at all, in that situation, that he wants my partnership. And if he does, I'll be there. But if he doesn't need me steadying it, I'm gonna try really hard not to do that, because our God is mighty to save. And I'll see you next week.